Thank you all so much for joining us today for the Barbara L. Jackson Lecture Series. Dr. Barbara L. Jackson was professor in the Division of Educational Leadership, Administration, and Policy at the Graduate School of Education from 1987 to 2008. And she served as chair of the division from 1997 to 2003. The Graduate School of Education established a lecture series in her name to honor her distinguished scholarship and contributions to the field of educational leadership. I also want to thank Dr. Jackson's daughter, Carolyn Jackson Smith, for joining us today. Thank you so much. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lester W. Young, Jr., Chancellor of the New York Board of Regents. Dr. Young received his doctoral degree from Fordham University, specializing in education and human development, and he also holds a master's degree from Brooklyn College in science. Now, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers after Chancellor Young's remarks. Please do so by typing your questions into the chat box, and then I will ask the questions. Chancellor Young, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you and good evening. It is a real honor and pleasure for me to address you this evening for the Dr. Barbara Jackson Lecture Series. I would like to place my remarks in a historical context. So between the years 1959 through 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would continue to deliver variations on a very specific theme. And the theme was remaining awake through the Great Revolution. And each time he did a variation on this theme, he began by recounting the story of Rip Van Winkle. And the point that he makes is that the most striking thing about the story of Rip Van Winkle is not merely that he slept 20 years, but that he slept through the revolution. And he goes further to say that one of the great liabilities of life is that all too many people find themselves living amidst a great period of social change, and yet they fail to develop the new attitudes and the new mental responses that the new situation demands. Now, currently, the disproportionate and significant impact of COVID-19, along with the substantial national attention on the current reality of racism and bigotry, has created what has been described as a vision-building opportunity. This is a time to think and act differently and dismantle the many unfounded and deep-seated preconceptions about the potential and value of large segments of our state's population. There exists a moral and economic imperative to remove the inequities that stand in the way of success for whole segments of New York's student population. This reality underscored the imperative to rebuild our systems of education with justice and equity. I believe in this moment, this is a time for bold actions that are designed to recast what is possible for all students. Further, I believe that leaders from all sectors must explore the actions it will take to accelerate the pace of our nation's progress toward fairness, justice, equality, and equity, not just in our schools, but throughout society as a whole. Now, to get back to this remaining awake during the revolution, Dr. King also said that now the great question facing us today is whether we will remain awake through this world-shaking revolution and achieve the new mental attitudes which the situations and current conditions demand? Or will we miss our moment? And I would also suggest that if there was ever a leadership moment, it is now. So first, I would like to thank the Dean of the Graduate School of Education, Dr. José Luis Alvarado, for inviting me to deliver this year's Dr. Barbara Jackson Lecture. I would also like to provide the following personal context for my remarks. First, just a bit about my own journey in education. You know, growing up in New York City, I attended public schools here in New York City through the beginning of high school. And it was right around the time that my father died that my mother decided that the best way to ensure that her son would receive a quality education is that she would send me to attend school in Virginia. And if you can imagine what it was like for a young person in 1961 to find himself leaving New York City to go to Richmond, Virginia, it was quite an eye-opener. But here's what occurred. The teachers that I was exposed to, they were African American, they were highly educated, they were caring, almost parent-like, and served as mentors and role models. These teachers inspired, they motivated, they instilled values and knowledge. They cultivated in the students a sense of pride in who they were and a desire for equality. These teachers constantly reinforced that education was a means of liberation, and we could make things better for ourselves, our families, and our communities. And they approached their task as if they were on a special calling. And as I think about it, they were all on a mission. Now, what I describe is supported by the research of Vanessa Siddell Walker, Thomas Sowell, Faustine Jones, and Dr. Jacqueline Irvine. And in each of these instances, they describe the qualities of teachers that taught during one of America's dark periods. The second point that I would make is that I knew Dr. Barbara Jackson personally, and I considered her to be a visionary scholar, a role model, a mentor, and a friend. Dr. Jackson was an inspiration to all who were aspiring to education leadership. She reminded me in her temperament, in her way of talking to us and encouraging us, of those high school teachers that I had when I attended school in the segregated South. And I believe it was perhaps her exposure to the historically Black institutions of Atlanta University and Morgan State College that I was actually experiencing. And so when I think about this lecture series, and I think about the kinds of interactions I had with Dr. Jackson and what she stood for, as well as those high school teachers that I described, and how they impacted my own journey, it is similar to what Professor Emerita Dr. Aisha Ray from the Erickson Institute points out and refers to as insider knowledge. It was as if these teachers understood what it was like to be me in that moment. And I'm going to get back to that as I go through my presentation this evening. Now, in 2012, President Barack Obama, in announcing the My Brother's Keeper initiative, he said that the most important thing we can do to secure the future of our nation, and I would add to that our state as well, is to do whatever is necessary to ensure that all of our students are able to go as far as their hopes, their dreams, and hard work will take them. But that can only happen if we provide each and every one of them with a high quality education that they deserve. We are in what I consider to be an incredible moral moment. And what we do in this moment, the decisions we make, the actions we take, what we deem important, and finally, who we deem important, will impact generations to come. Now, during the years 1983 through 1993, Paulo Freire and Donaldo Macedo engaged in an ongoing communication, and this communication became known as the dialogue. And Paulo Freire says in one of these sessions, to think of history as possibility is to recognize education as possibility. It is to recognize that if education cannot do everything, it can achieve some things. So during my acceptance speech as Chancellor of the New York State Board of Regents, I advanced the notion of a new possible. And it was in the context that education is possibility, that education makes things possible, that education can counter the conditions and catapult you over one's circumstances. I also feel that many of the challenges facing us during the 21st century are this whole notion of how do we transform our education system rather than merely getting schools to do better what they've always done before. Ensuring that all students in all communities experience what Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois described as the right to learn. We must work to rebuild structures and systems to educate all students, not just a few, to understand ideas deeply, perform proficiently, and we must teach all students in ways that help different kinds of learners find productive paths to knowledge as they learn to live constructively together. In May of this year, the Board of Regents took the bold step of advancing a policy based on the belief that every student has the right to a rich, supportive, and engaging education. And that right applies to all students, regardless of race, gender, LGBTQ identity, disability status, language spoken, socioeconomic status, faith, or zip code. We took this step because all New York students must graduate from high school with the knowledge, the skills, and commitments necessary for civic engagement and academic and career options. This goal requires that we apply everything we know about the science of learning and the art of teaching. And I would dare say we know a lot more than we used to. What Linda Darling Hammond and her colleagues describe as the 6 pillars. 1, a focus on meaningful and deeper learning. 2, human growth and development in learning. 3, increasing professional capacity, both for leaders and teachers. 4, sufficient resources used wisely. 5, connected communities and student and family supports. And finally, closing the digital divide and strengthening distance and blended learning. So I'll just give you one example. In order to fully engage in deeper and more meaningful learning, we will, as a state, have to ensure a meaningful statewide assessment strategy, one that provides multiple ways for all students to demonstrate learning and earn a meaningful diploma, one that communicates to others evidence about the learning process, and finally, one that provides feedback about learning and teaching to students, families, and teachers. Now, this may require that we move away from the belief that a score on a single assessment is a meaningful predictor of a young person's future success. And it may require us to re-examine what a high school diploma should represent and what it takes to earn one. This will require a shift away from the deficit-oriented strategies and decontextualized modes of assessment toward more authentic, formative assessments that are part of a coherent strategy to improve student learning. And I would just stop here. I believe in my role as the Chancellor of the Board of Regents, that what we say, the policies that we pass, shouldn't be just mere rhetoric. And so to concretize what I just described, during our last Regents meeting, we described 4 major funding initiatives that the state will engage in starting this year. And the one that directly speaks to the assessment strategy is the recently announced Performance Assessment Network pilot. We plan to pilot in diverse regions across the state of New York a performance pilot which gets at establishing a statewide assessment strategy that's designed to get at this whole notion of deeper and meaningful learning for all students. Now, as I've begun this talk this evening, you've heard me reference all. And I just want to underscore what that's all about. My experience, and I have to say my 50 years of experience in public education has taught me that, unfortunately, our system of education, when we've talked about all has never meant all. And I think in this moment that we have an opportunity to do something that we've never done before. And that is to build systems and put structures in place that would ensure that all young people can be successful in school, not just some youngsters, not just some who live in low needs districts, but all young people, regardless of their circumstance, can have the opportunity of a high quality education. And so my colleagues on the Board of Regents decided that we would base our strategy on 2 core pillars. The first, that you've probably heard, in May of this year, we passed the state's first diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. And I would just say to you this, and I'll talk more about it, that we don't see diversity, equity, and inclusion as a thing. We see this as foundational to the entire education enterprise in New York State. The second pillar is really to shift the state education department as an organization to move them from its primary concern of monitoring and compliance to one of service. That we understand that, yes, we do by by Constitution, we must have a monetary compliance component. But our primary focus should be on supporting districts, the 1,000 districts in New York State, as they work to make diversity, equity, and inclusion the foundation of their enterprise. So throughout my presentation, I'll be talking about the Regents and the department's efforts surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the actions that all schools and districts must take to accelerate the pace of our progress toward fairness, justice, equity in all New York State schools. And as I see it, it comes down to providing all students with the opportunity to be successful. It's very interesting. I was thinking about the early days in my career, and I had the occasion of visiting both Central Park East and Central Park West. And I remember an interaction with Deborah Mayer, the founder. And she said that it's not a question of, is it possible to educate all children well? She said the real question is, do we want it badly enough? Right? And it reminds me of what Ron Edmonds said back in the mid-70s. Do we have the will to see all young people be successful in school? So the New York State Board of Regents Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion strategy is intended to identify ways to remove discriminatory barriers to student achievement and well-being that relate to ethnicity, race, faith, family structure, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, ability, and mental health. To support the successful implementation of this policy requires all school boards to adopt a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. And the goal is to provide equitable learning opportunities for all students. So again, the question confronting school leaders is not how do we create one strong school, one strong class, but how do we create a system of strong schools in each and every district throughout New York State? And I would just add to that, just very practically, how do we ensure that all neighborhood schools are schools that we would want our own children to attend? So through our policy, the State Education Department will encourage and support efforts across the state to create within every New York State school what we've described as an ecosystem of success that is built upon the foundation of the best ideals of diversity, equity, inclusion, but also access, opportunity, innovation, confidence, trust, and respect, and caring relationships. There is, as I'm sure you all know, a growing body of research that describes the benefits to students when schools and districts have strong diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and practices. Now, these benefits include academic, cognitive, civic, social, emotional, and academic outcomes. And we all, by this time, are familiar with the work of Latz and Billings in this area, Geneva Gay, Django Paris, and others. But at the same time, there is a controversy that is occurring. And some of our efforts have been met with strong opposition. the pushback has been so heated and dangerous that in some places, the Justice Department has had to step in to ensure the safety of school board members. And by the way, you know, some people have said to me, well, New York is not Arizona. Well, I will tell you that there are places in New York where the opposition and pushback has been so strong that the discussions have been so heated that it's created a dangerous situation. And people really feel like they are under attack. But here's what I would say, and I would do it in the following. If you believe that every member of humanity has a contribution to make to the whole, and our uniqueness, our cultures, our languages, and lived experiences are actually strengths, and that we're all strengthened when all members of our society have voice and are encouraged to contribute, then you believe in diversity. And if you also believe that everyone should have access to the process and opportunities and resources they need to be successful, and districts and schools must remove the predictability of success or failure based on race, socioeconomics, language spoken, social or cultural factors, including zip code, then you believe in equity. And if you believe that schools should foster a culture of open-mindedness, compassion, and inclusiveness among individuals and groups, then you believe in inclusion. And further, if you believe that providing access for all students to new and different perspectives, cultures, beliefs, and practices that enhance the learning experience, then you believe in diversity. And if you believe in fair treatment and opportunity for all, but you also at the same time understand that fair is not always equal, and that we have a responsibility to remove barriers, access to programs, classes, and needed support. And by removing those barriers, we prepare all students to be actively engaged. If you believe that, then you believe in equity. And then finally, if you believe in order to develop a sense of that all schools should have within it building a sense of belonging, then we need to practice valuing difference. That if you believe it is important to teach and model respect for all, and that all of our schools and classrooms must allow students to feel safe, supported, and valued, then I would say you believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so our Board of Regents, we also believe that all students in New York State must feel that they are welcome, they belong, and they are supported in school. And we have based our DEI policy on 6 focused elements. The first is governance. And what we're asking is that all schools, all districts in New York State develop a DEI committee representative of all of the stakeholders, and that all school boards in New York State pass a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. The second element comes under the category of teaching and learning. And we are asking that all districts incorporate an inclusive, culturally responsive, and learning framework of reference to include, but not be limited to, curricular in all content areas, books and instructional materials, pedagogical practices, professional development, classroom grouping policies, student support systems, full and equitable opportunities to learn for all students, and multiple assessment strategies. The third element is family and community engagement. And just quite simply, we believe, as James Comer once said to me, we have to see young people in the context of the family, and the family in the context of the community. And we cannot break that connection with the school. So it's imperative that schools understand that they can't be apart from the family or the community. The fourth element is workforce diversity. That we must work to recruit, retain, and develop a diverse workforce in all areas and at all levels. And I would add, thereby reducing stereotypes and preparing students for an increasingly global society. And I would add what many have associated with the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and that is avoiding the danger of the single story. Because so many of our young people, so many of our systems are in fact based on that single narrative. And as the author suggests, that the danger of that single story is the danger that it can become the definitive story. The fifth element are diverse schools and learning opportunities, and where we're asking districts to take creative steps to enhance the level of socioeconomic and racial diversity within district schools, even if district student populations are relatively homogeneous, and examine the use of language which prevents some students from accessing and fully participating in district's classes, programs, and offerings. We understand that language matters, and it is therefore critical that districts eliminate the use of terms and phrases that perpetuate negative stereotypes and minimize student opportunities. Now, what am I suggesting here? One that I hear almost daily is that we continue to refer to students of colors as minority. And if you think about it, these young people are really part of the global majority. And so what's really behind this idea, this notion that we continue to refer to them as minority? And ensure that coursework, programs, and activities are accessible to all students, regardless of their disability status, native language, income level, or any other basis. And finally, that we provide student supports, we examine our discipline structures, and we work to ensure the total student well-being. And I would just underscore, there's lots of talk today. In fact, the jargon would suggest that in this moment, we need to focus primarily on social emotional development. And I don't argue that many of our young people, particularly are most in need in many communities, students of color, have experienced tremendous trauma over the last 2 years. But what we know about development and the developmental pathways is that these pathways do not work in isolation, right? So the health domain, the emotional domain, the social, the emotional, the linguistic, and the cognitive, they all work together. They all work together. And so what we have to figure out in schools is how do we engage and employ the kinds of techniques, strategies, and pedagogical practices that inextricably link the developmental domains to ensure that we're reaching all students. Now, these 6 elements operate within what I had mentioned earlier, culturally responsive and sustaining framework. And we believe that this framework is intended to help education stakeholders all across the state create student-centered learning environments that do four things. They affirm the cultural identity of our young people. They foster positive academic outcomes. They elevate historically marginalized voices. And four, they empower students as change agents. Recently, the department released what we've described as our culturally responsive and sustaining roadmap, together with resources for educators and families. And the roadmap supports this culturally responsive framework and is part of our commitment to the board's policy on diversity, equity, and inclusion in New York State schools. The roadmap and instructional briefs are just the beginning of several resources that we plan to develop and to share to assist districts and communities as they develop their policies that educate all students effectively and equitably. The addition of these important resources will mark another step in our journey toward equity for all students. Now, the culturally responsive and sustaining framework is intended to position New York State educators to acknowledge, value, and leverage the wealth of knowledge found in all New York State communities. It draws on decades of research in asset-based pedagogies that recognize that cultural differences should be treated as assets for teaching and learning. The New York State Culture Responsive Sustaining Roadmap is organized into 3 phases with key action steps for each one. Phase 1, raise awareness and support for culturally responsive sustaining framework. Phase 2, build capacity for the culturally responsive and sustaining framework. And phase 3, full implementation. Now, we believe that our DEI policy has another major characteristic. While much of what I've said requires tremendous change and effort, not only for the P-12 community, but it also requires a change in direction on the part of the higher education community as well. It is incumbent upon the entire higher education community to join in these efforts to bring greater opportunities to all students. It is in the academy that some of the problems can be solved. For example, how do we accelerate learning? What does the research say? When we're preparing principals and superintendents, are we really preparing them to get the most out of a diverse population, to help these young people go as far as their hopes, dreams, and hard work will take them? And building and creating the kinds of opportunities that will accommodate more and greater diversity requires a change in every institution at every level, from the academy to the district to the school building. I would also add this, that one of the changes that I believe that we need to see is a change that I believe Fordham has already been a leader in, and that is moving the institution from the core to making the community the core. Finally, one of the other big system changes, and I touched on it earlier when I talked about moving away from the deficit approach. We need to move to a system, or I should say move from a system that identifies and treats to one that is more accommodating of a wider range of behaviors, as well as recognizing cultural wealth. I believe that the work ahead of us is clear. After the stress and anguish, tension, and sometimes tragedy and apprehension of this moment, we've been presented with a vision building opportunity, a time to think and act differently and dismantle the many unfounded and deep-seated preconceptions about the potential and value of large segments of our state's population. John Stuart Mills once wrote, "When a society requires to be rebuilt, there is no use in attempting to rebuild it on old plans." So too is our responsibility as education leaders. This is not a time to simply return to the past. This is a place where far too many are frequently traumatized and deprived of the possibility of optimism and aspiration. It is a place where far too many New York students and their families are being treated differently, have been treated unfairly because of their race, and that is tragically normal. We believe that in this moment, we should consider a new possible for all New York State students. And as the pundits debate and impact the historic moment and its impact on public education, school districts across the country will write the actual story. Our actions in this unprecedented moment could do much more to dismantle inequity than exacerbate it. We have a choice about this crisis. As educators, we can make a new normal, better than the old. And I would conclude with this. R.M. Franklin wrote a wonderful book entitled Moral Leadership, Integrity, Courage, and Imagination. And he states that courage is leadership affirmed. Courage requires that we step forward, particularly when so many have decided to step back. I call on those of us who have accepted the charge of educating our next generation to defy the force of complacency and step forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chancellor Young. Just inspiring words indeed. And we do have some questions that have been posed. So we'll start with the first one. How do we as a community ensure success for our minority or students of color in today's job market, especially within minority communities, i.e., many institutions throughout this country do not provide a head start, quote unquote, if you will, towards job training and development?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question. So one of the areas that I didn't mention, along with our DEI policy, we are embarking on a graduation option, and it's really around civic engagement. And I believe, and I guess I'll give you an advanced look of some of the things that I think about. I actually believe that we need to include economic mobility within our education structure. You know, it is not enough. It is clear that it's not enough that young people just graduate with Regents diplomas. We need to provide young people with exposure and opportunity and options. And while I am not a fan of the old vocational model tracking system, what I am in favor of is how do we ensure that we practice what we know? And what we know is that 85% of the job market today requires a post-secondary education. We know that. So what is it going to require a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now? And so we have to do a couple of things. We have to ensure that all young people have the kind of quality academic education they need, but they also have to have a career education that will allow them to live in a very flexible economy, right? It's not like it was when we were coming up. And so we have to prepare young people for change. And so I think this notion of including the skills and dispositions that are needed for economic mobility, that needs to exist in our school system.
Thank you so much. We have another question here, and it is, what is the reason behind the state's 1% limit on alternatively assessed students when we know that special education students learn at a slower rate to begin with? And then we have the effects of the last 18 months on top of that.
Yeah. Well, as you know, well, maybe you know or you don't know, but I will say that New York was one of the leaders in requesting a waiver from some of those federal requirements. And unfortunately, our waiver request was denied. But we, and I guess I should say a little bit more about who we are on the board and who we are with the State Education Department. In addition to serving as chancellor, my background, I am an educator, so I get it. Our commissioner of education is also an educator. In fact, we were actually colleagues. We were principals at the same time. We were superintendents at the same time. And she reminds me, we were even senior superintendents at the same time. But the other important point that I should make, she's the first Latina to hold that job, and I am the first person of African descent to hold that job. So I think we understand that we should be, when I say all students, I mean just that, all students. And so we have to think very critically and creatively about how we provide the kind of assessments, but also opportunities for young people to earn a meaningful high school diploma, because we understand that just because you happen to be in a special education class, that should not reduce your opportunity for a meaningful high school diploma. So we have to fix that. And one of the, and I'll end with this, one of the areas that we started pre-pandemic, we were holding a series of statewide public forums on the high school diploma, and we had to stop. We are beginning those. And if you go on our website, you will see that we will be hosting a series of public forums for stakeholders all across the state to gain input on what you think we should be focusing on when we consider assessment as well as requirements for graduation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If I may add, at least from my experience in California with regards to exceptions for alternative assessments, the danger, of course, is in that you may end up with too great a number of students of color ending up with alternative assessments and thereby sort of bypassing some of the accountability systems. And so there's a balance there that has to be taken into account. Next question we have is, with school leadership and representation being important factors in student success, what are some of the initiatives that New York State and the districts are undertaking to increase representation of people of color at the administrative level?
That is the question. A year and a half ago, we issued to the governor and the legislature the first diversity report. And sadly, what the report showed is at that time there was a decline in diversity, not only in the teaching workforce, but in the leadership workforce as well. As a result, we, for the last, this is actually the 5th year, we have implemented something called the Teacher Opportunity Corps that actually is operating in 16 universities across the state that targets aspiring teachers of color. We believe this has been so successful that we're planning to bring this to the graduate level, because we think that, number one, diversity in the workforce, and in particular in the leadership workforce, is not just good only for students of color, it's really good for everyone. And so we believe, yes, the research is clear what the impact it has on students of color, but we're saying that diversity is really good for everyone. And so we will, over the course of the next couple of months, be announcing incentives for graduate schools to consider creative ways to have a more diverse graduate student population.
Now, there's a follow-up question to that, in that one of the attendees is asking, how do we get involved with the consortium pilot? How do we plan to have, are there going to be grant-funded specialists to support implementation, or what are the plans for sort of expanding on this work that you've done in this area?
Well, there are a couple of things. I announced what was called the Performance Assessment Network Pilot. One of the initiatives that's included in that is the consortium. However, we are prohibited from expanding beyond the 35 schools. That's why we're conducting this new pilot. So in essence, what we're suggesting is we will be working with the consortium. In fact, we've met with the founder, and they will be one of the initiatives that we will be piloting across the state. The other two, by the way, will be the International Baccalaureate, because one of the questions, what we believe, is that this should not be for just some students, that we've got to figure out ways how we can provide these opportunities for all students. The third component of this network will be an expansion of our CTE, or Career Technical Education Pilot Assessment Initiative as well. And it's our hope, as a result of the pilot, that there will be more opportunities for more schools to participate in this, what I'm calling statewide New York assessment strategy.
Great, thank you so much. And the truth is that, as you mentioned, it really is a whole system, and it's incumbent upon us in higher education then to commit to preparing more faculty of color and to prepare more students of color as well. So teachers of color. Now, question here is, next question is, how can we develop systems that truly examine what is happening in each and every classroom, given that our current observation protocols do not give us accurate data on instructional practices?
That's an interesting question. I'm not certain. I think there are a couple of ways to think about the question. I think that there are places where the information that is gleaned from observations is providing accurate information, but what I think, it is not just the single walk-in observation of a moment. I think that where school leaders and teachers understand the importance of support, they understand that there should be an opportunity for teachers to receive feedback, to take that feedback and build on it and come at it again. And I believe it's the job of the school leader to help that teacher be successful. See, I am not of the school of thought that the observation is just an evaluative tool that I'm using to hold over your head. I believe that the observation should really, in fact, that you should have a school culture where teachers welcome an opportunity for the supervisor to give them feedback on what's going on, and where there's a healthy exchange about what's going on and how that data is used. Now, I'm not silly nor naive. I do understand the genesis of the question. I know that there are probably places where this is not happening. However, what I am suggesting is that this will probably be the first time where you will hear from the highest chambers of education in New York State that we have a different expectation. And our expectation is that leaders should be supporting instruction and supporting teachers, and not just using the observation as a tool to evaluate. I don't think that system has worked, and it certainly hasn't worked in our most in need communities.
Thank you so much, Ned. And just if I may interject, I was a part of the California State University system Deans of Education that actually undertook a series of studies to look at schools that were closing the achievement gap. And what we found was exactly what you're talking about, Chancellor Young. That is that the administrators were first and foremost instructional leaders who could step into the classroom and coach and mentor each and every one teacher within the school setting. And it wasn't an evaluative process as much as it was formative assessment for the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And then the teacher was able to gradually improve, and they were part of professional learning communities and improving their particular practice. But you're absolutely spot on that. Now, here's another question. In your view, does the current K-12 history curriculum reinforce or dismantle racial inferiority, especially in the minds of children of color? It's possible the history curriculum paints a picture of the past that is either inaccurate or doesn't go back far enough.
Well, the answer is simple. Yes. yes, and yes. I think so here's the first context to my answer. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you view this, New York State is not a state that allows the state education department to mandate curriculum. Curriculum is really the purview of school districts in New York State. So each school district has the responsibility for developing and adapting curriculum at the local level. You know, we can recommend, we can suggest, and our role by state law is that we develop standards for curriculum. But even there, we're not where we should be. And I think to the point of the question, the absence of the diversity of the state in the history books it speaks loudly for what we're talking about. And I think we all know that we in this moment have to do a better job at teaching the true history. And what I like to say is there is a difference between the truth and the whole truth. And I think that part of what has been going on is that we've never been able to get to the whole truth. And so it's become such a flashpoint nationally. As you know, there are some states that are passing laws to not teach what we know to be true. So the truth is really under assault. Now, the final part that I want to say, though, and I think this is important for school leaders to understand, and I've had to learn this, that not every problem that is confronted by schools is an education problem. Many of our problems are actually political in nature. And so we've got to be very careful that we're not applying education solutions to political problems. And so if, Malcolm X said many years ago that when you're under stress, the first thing you've got to do is make sure you get the problem right. And so if the problem is a political one, that, by the way, requires a political solution. And so I don't know that I need to say more, but I think I'm making my point.
No, there is a follow-up to that as you were responding. In one of the participants noted, it is true that there are limits in terms of what you can dictate districts teach as far as content, but doesn't the state write the Regents exam?
Absolutely.
And if there's a misalignment between the exam, so that's where maybe some pressure could be exerted, right? To make sure that certain areas are covered if the exam is presenting a much more inclusive view of history, let's say.
Yeah, I will say that I think you're absolutely right. And just for the audience to know, just before we shut down for the pandemic, I should say, we had a wonderful Regents meeting with a group of high school students that actually did an analysis of the Regents examination. And they went point by point with us to show us the inaccuracies and the failings in that exam. And so one of what I'm hoping will happen during these public forums is that we've included an opportunity for student voice as well as all the other stakeholders. It's my hope that as we conduct these forums, that the various stakeholders from around the state will make real concrete recommendations as to what they would like to see us do.
I see. Great. Now, parents and community stakeholders can be powerful allies, but can also be voters who stem change in budget votes and school boards. What guidance or training is the New York State Department of Education planning to offer leaders in community outreach and change leadership? Can you provide an example of language that you'd like to see become the norm in the culture when we speak of education?
Well, there are a few ways. I know that right now there's a bill that's being talked about strongly in New York State that addresses the first issue, and that is the very uneven information distribution system in New York State. So the first question that we have to address is, do parents and communities have the information that they need? And I would say to you, in the very communities that are most vulnerable, they're the last ones to find out things. In fact, many parents will say, they know how their school is doing when it appears in the newspaper. What I'm saying, there's something wrong with that. So I think you're absolutely right. When I said to you that we need to see students in the context of the family, I wasn't just blowing smoke. I believe that. I believe that with my whole fiber, that part of the challenge is that we have not involved and engaged communities and families as allies in this process, and we have to do a better job with that. So the first thing I think is that there needs to be greater attention around this bill that I'm talking about. And I know it's gotten lots of traction, lots of support. And those of you who are affiliated with a variety of the stakeholder groups in New York. I'm sure you could access the information on the bill. The second is we have a set of regulations that speak to parent engagement. And I'm convinced, I mean, it talks about, parents should be part of the school leadership team, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm convinced that that's insufficient. I think that just saying that 5 parents or whatever the number of parents that should be involved and they have to sign off on the plan. See, I know what happens at the school level. And I know where you have leadership that's committed to engagement, it happens. But I know in other places, it doesn't happen. And my concern, again, is in the places that need the most attention, that's the places where it's been neglected. So I think we have to do a much better job of trying to figure out how we do that. The other point that I would make is that there are a lot of elected officials that I've been in touch with who have said to me, they think it's time, perhaps it's time to really change the law, and that perhaps we should reposition the Board of Regents and State Education Department where necessary to begin to mandate these things that we know are good for students and communities. So I would say that is a discussion. The final part of this, I would say, is that there are 17 members of the board. 13 of us represent judicial districts, 4 at large. And please, half of the members for the very first time in the Board of Regents history are educators. So for the first time, half of the members of the board are real educators. And so I think if there are certain positions or recommendations that people want to make, they need to make that to us in writing. And believe me, if I am CC'd, you will get an answer.
Great. Now, there are many superintendents that are stepping down in the face of opposition to DEI. How do you see NYSSBA, or the New York State School Boards Association, playing a role in this?
Well, there's only so much the school boards and the School Boards Association could do, because remember, they're elected by a community. And so I'm going to answer the question by giving you a real life situation. I recently met with a group of superintendents representing a portion of upstate New York. And one of the superintendents said to me, well, Dr. Young, here's what you have to understand. I represent a community where they not only fly Confederate flags, they use them as curtains. Now, he was giving me a message, right? And then another one said to me, well, look, I represent a low-need community, and it's not diverse. And at a board meeting, they got up and said, it's not diverse, and they want to keep it that way. And so this is what we're talking about. This is the playing field that we're in. The School Boards Association has, in my opinion, done a better than fair job. They currently post on their website a series of tools that board members can use to address some of these situations. They also have come out with a series of development sessions for boards to help them figure this out. And they took the bold step of having, and it's on their website, they actually have their own diversity, equity, and inclusion policy statement as a model for other school boards. And so I think in a lot of ways, the New York State School Boards Association is far ahead of others. Could we all do more? I think the answer is yes, but I also know that there are places in New York where the opposition has been so fierce. And in fact, they not only have been able to remove superintendents, they've been able to vote out school board members and take over boards. And so one of the concerns is not only is the truth under assault, but some have even termed that the democracy is under assault. And so we've got to, I think there's no substitute for involvement. We have to be more involved, all of us.
Agreed. On that point, just to play devil's advocate, what would your response be to those who say, why focus on DEI when it only creates further polarization within our society?
Yeah, well, here's what I would say. That we are currently living in a situation where we have systems that advantage some and disadvantage others. And I would say to you that if you support that I understand why you don't want diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I think that all those that recognize that we're in a system that advantages some and disadvantages others, unearned advantage and unearned disadvantages. If you understand that system and you want to do something about it, then you would support our efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's what I think. And I would also say this, that I believe what's at the bottom of the disparities in student outcome and performance are the kinds of racial inequities and bigotries and low self-esteem, et cetera, that exists in many of our systems.
Mm-hmm. Great. With regards to what was said about the Regents exam, is there a way to bridge that gap so that teachers are able to work from the top of their intelligence and not be limited by the demands of a particular test or exam that at times to be used as guidelines presented to ensure that tests are working within the guidelines effectively? Is that possible?
Well, one of the best ways to do that, and I don't know how widely this is known, but the exams, the Regents exams are the one exam that are developed with teachers all across the state of New York. Now the question is, who are the teachers? So I would say to you that the answer is there's ample opportunity for teacher involvement and engagement in the development of these exams. What we've got to do a better job of is ensuring that there's an equitable distribution of those teachers. That's what I think the great challenge is. We've got to ensure, for instance, that we have not only, and not because I'm picking on Manhattan, but not only teachers from Manhattan, but we've got to make sure that we have teachers from Central Brooklyn or East New York or the South Bronx. We have to make sure that those teachers become part of the system.
Completely agree. And I do want to recognize that we're approaching 7 o'clock, and I want to thank you so much. If there's one last, are you okay if there's one more question?
Sure. I'm a graduate of Fordham, absolutely.
If there's, here's a question. How do you propose to achieve equity when schools have such great disparities in their funding and resource allocation? Yeah, well,
that was an excuse before this year. And I know people don't like to hear that, but the truth is, the happy truth is that there is now currently more money in New York public education than there's ever been in the history of public education. So we can't say there aren't sufficient funds. The question that we ought to be asking is how is that money being used? Are we using it in the same old ways that we've always used it? Or are we using it in ways that are designed to get us to the outcomes that we need? And I believe that all stakeholder groups have to be more articulate and more demanding about having input as to how those funds are being used. The Biden administration went way out on a limb, providing a lot more money and a lot more flexibility to all states. But they also said there ought to be ways for communities, families, and stakeholders to have input. And what I fear is that when that doesn't happen, no one does anything. And I think this is the moment. That's why when I started, I said if there was ever a moment for leadership, and leadership is not just about the designated leaders, it's what all of us do in a leadership moment. You know, it is what are the decisions that we're making? You know, what do we deem important and who's important? So I would say that for at least for the next 4 years in New York, you know, we just passed, we equalized the foundation aid formula. So when the federal money runs out for the next 3 years, we will have increased money to districts under foundation aid. So the money will be there. It's there. The question will be, how are we using those funds? Are we using it in a differentiated way? Are we targeting? What are we doing that makes sense based on what we know? And again, I believe one of the things that we can do a better job of is be more engaging of colleges and universities, because I think they could help us think through some of these problems.
Couldn't agree more, and I would love to be a partner. I'm sure that colleagues across the state would feel the same way. In that, the truth is there is strength in collaborative efforts, and working on our respective strengths. I'm confident that we can, you know, we're definitely on the right path. I want to thank you, Chancellor Young, for your time, and I want to thank everyone who attended. This has been enlightening and inspiring. I'm excited. I won't be able to sleep till very late tonight because I'm so excited. But again, thank you so much. This will be available. We're recording the session, so it will be made available to anyone if you want to share it with colleagues, etc. So again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, and onwards and forwards.
Thank you.
Chris,
thank you.
take good care. Good night, everyone.
Good night.